Alexander the Great passed away on June 10th, 323 BC, leaving behind a vast empire that extended from Macedonia in Europe to the Indus Valley in South Asia. His death triggered a series of disputes among his former generals, sparking a succession crisis. Two primary factions emerged in the aftermath. The first, led by Meleager, backed Alexander's half-brother Aridaeus as the successor. The second, led by Perdiccas, the senior cavalry commander, argued for delaying the decision until the birth of Alexander's unborn child by Roxana. Eventually, the factions reached a compromise. Aridaeus would ascend as King Philip III and rule jointly with Roxana's child, provided it was a male heir. Perdiccas was appointed regent of the empire, with Meleager serving as his deputy. However, Perdiccas soon eliminated Meleager and other opposing leaders, consolidating his authority. In the division of power at Babylon, Perdiccas rewarded his loyal generals by appointing them as satraps over various regions of the empire. Ptolemy was granted Egypt. Laomedon received Syria and Phoenicia. Philotas took control of Cilicia. Python assumed command of Media. Antigonus was given Phrygia, Lycia, and Pamphylia. Asander governed Caria. Menander oversaw Lydia. Lysimachus ruled Thrace. Leonatus took charge of Hellespontine, Phrygia, and Neoptolemus was assigned Armenia. Macedonia was placed under the joint rule of Antipater, who had governed them during Alexander's reign, and Craterus, one of Alexander's trusted lieutenants. Eumenes of Cardia, Alexander's secretary, was granted Cappadocia and Paphlagonia. In the eastern territories, Perdiccas largely maintained Alexander's existing arrangements. Taxiles and Porus continued to rule their Indian kingdoms. Oxyartes, Alexander's father-in-law, governed Gandhara. Zebertius controlled Arachosia and Gedrosia. Stasanor ruled Aria and Drangiana. Philip oversaw Bactria and Sogdiana. Phrataphernes managed Parthia and Hyrcania. Pusestas administered Persis. Tlepolemus was in charge of Carmania. Atropates governed northern Media. Archon ruled Babylonia, and Arcesilas controlled northern Mesopotamia. Meanwhile, Athens was already gearing up for war when news of Alexander's death in June 323 BC reached them. The conflict began shortly after, likely in early September. Once the war was officially declared, Athens sent 50 talents to Leosthenes to pay his mercenaries, and the allied Greek states appointed him general of the Greeks. From Taenarum, Leosthenes moved to Aetolia, where he took command of 7,000 Aetolian troops, then proceeded to Boeotia to join forces with Athens' contingent of 5,000 hoplites, 2,000 mercenaries, and 500 cavalry. Near Plataea, Leosthenes achieved an early victory over a combined force of Boeotians, Euboeans, and Macedonians, the garrison from the Cadmea. This success encouraged most of central Greece to join the revolt. With an army of roughly 30,000 men, Leosthenes marched north to defend the Thermopylae Pass, anticipating the Macedonian response. To prevent the rebellion from spreading to Thessaly, Antipater advanced south with a Macedonian army of 13,000 hoplites and 600 cavalry, supported by a fleet of 110 triremes, carrying supplies along the coast. In Thessaly, Antipater recruited around 2,000 cavalry before moving toward the Greek forces at Thermopylae. However, the Thessalian cavalry betrayed him, destroying his Macedonian cavalry in the process. Antipater managed to retreat with his phalanx intact and took refuge in Lamia, about 15 kilometers north of Thermopylae, the only nearby city still loyal to Macedonia. Leosthenes approached the city with his troops and set up a siege camp. Historian N. Bigel Hammond praised Antipater's decision as brilliant. as it forced the Greeks into a difficult siege of Lamia, preventing them from invading Macedonia while leaving a significant Macedonian force at their rear. This marked the first Macedonian defeat on Greek soil in 30 years. At the start of the war, Athens possessed a formidable navy of over 410 warships. However, they could only crew about 200 ships, still outnumbering the Macedonian fleet in the Aegean. By 322 BC, however, the balance shifted with the arrival of the Macedonian admiral Clytus the White, who commanded a fleet of 240 ships. These vessels were part of a massive navy of 1,000 ships commissioned by Alexander before his death. Although Alexander's grand plans were abandoned, some ships had already been constructed in the Levant. In late summer 322 BC, the largest naval battle of the Lamian War took place off the island of Amorgos in the Cyclades, near Samos. Clytus challenged Athenian control of the region, and the undermanned Athenian fleet suffered a crushing defeat. Another potential defeat may have occurred near the Hellespont, modern Dardanelles, as Athens relied on Black Sea grain shipments through these straits, which were controlled by Macedonia. Antipater spent most of the winter of 323 to 322 BC besieged in Lamia, but remained active. The Macedonian army conducted sorties, during one of which Leosthenes was killed, possibly by a slinger. Antipater awaited reinforcements from Lysimachus in Thrace, but Lysimachus was dealing with a revolt by Seuthes, king of the Odrysians. Antipater also called for aid from Leonatus in Phrygia and Craterus in Cilicia. Leonatus arrived first, crossing the Hellespont after the Athenian navy was defeated. His motives were not purely altruistic, as he sought to marry Cleopatra, Alexander's sister, and potentially claim the Macedonian throne with the backing of Alexander's mother, Olympias, who opposed Antipater. Leonatus brought an army of 20,000 infantry and 1,500 cavalry to Thessaly in early spring 322 BC, but failed to coordinate with Antipater. The new Greek commander, Antipholus, lifted the siege of Lamia to confront Leonatus. The ensuing battle was primarily a cavalry engagement, with the Thessalian cavalry gaining the upper hand and killing Leonatus. However, the Macedonian infantry retreated to higher ground, avoiding a complete rout. The exact location of the battle is debated, with some placing it at Melatea, north of Lamia, while others suggest the Pelasgiotid plain. This Greek victory allowed Antipater to escape Lamia, while the Greek army was occupied fighting Leonatus. Antipater combined his forces with those of Leonatus and Craterus, who arrived from Cilicia with 10,000 hoplites, including 6,000 veterans, 1,500 cavalry, and 1,000 Persian archers and slingers. Antipater now commanded a massive army of 40,000 soldiers, 3,000 archers and slingers, and 5,000 cavalry, far outnumbering the Greek forces of 25,000 hoplites and 3,500 cavalry. And he was ready for the last stand in the Battle of Cranon in August 322 BC. However, the Thessalians had great confidence in their horses, renowned for their strength, size, and stamina. Antiphilos, the general commanding the Athenian and allied forces, positioned his cavalry on the right flank. In response, Antipater placed his own cavalry directly opposite them on his left flank. Antiphilos initiated the battle by ordering his cavalry to charge. The two mounted forces collided, and after a fierce clash, the stronger and more resilient Thessalian cavalry succeeded in driving back the Macedonians. The fighting then shifted to the infantry, where the Macedonians maintained steady pressure, gradually forcing the anti-Macedonian forces to retreat to higher ground on the battlefield. Despite this, the anti-Macedonian infantry held their position, repelling further attacks. Meanwhile, the cavalry, realizing they were now isolated from their infantry support, chose to withdraw. The battle raged on until the Athenians finally surrendered. The casualties were lopsided, with 500 Athenians and their allies killed, compared to just 130 Macedonian losses. The arrival of Craterus's veteran Macedonian troops proved crucial, as their discipline and experience overwhelmed the Greek forces. Antipater's strategy of dealing with each Greek city individually further fragmented the coalition, ensuring Macedonian victory. Following their defeat, the Greek coalition collapsed. Antipater imposed harsh terms on Athens, including the installation of a Macedonian garrison at Monikia and the extradition of anti-Macedonian leaders. Demosthenes, Hyperides, and others were hunted down, marking the end of Athenian resistance. The war devastated Athens' economy, halting building projects and crippling industries like marble and metalwork. Famine followed in the early 3rd century, cementing the city's decline. The revolt known as the Lamian War in southern Macedonia had come to an end. Meanwhile, Cappadocia, which had experienced several smaller uprisings, was subdued by Eumenes. However, the internal power struggles among the Diadochi were far from over. Factionalism continued to grow among Alexander's former generals and companions as Antigonus, Antipater, and Craterus began to view Perdiccas as a man who had amassed too much power and was using it for his own advantage. Perdiccas had initially agreed to marry Nicaea, the daughter of Antipater, but in 322 BC, he broke off the engagement when Olympias, the mother of Alexander the Great, offered him the hand of Alexander's full sister, Cleopatra. Given that Philip III was intellectually disabled and Alexander IV was a mere child with limited recognition, this marriage would have granted Perdiccas a direct claim to be Alexander's legitimate successor rather than just a regent. This move antagonized Antipater, while Antigonus had his own reasons to fear Perdiccas. Additionally, Craterus felt disregarded by Perdiccas despite his prominent role in Alexander's army. As a result, Antipater, Craterus, and Antigonus formed an alliance and decided to revolt against him. Craterus was appointed to lead their coalition army, which quickly departed from Macedonia with the intent to overthrow Perdiccas. Perdiccas responded by dispatching Eumenes and Neoptolemus with an army to the Hellespont, aiming to prevent Craterus from crossing into Asia. However, before the armies could engage, Neoptolemus, envious of Eumenes, defected with a few hundred cavalry and joined forces with Craterus. After successfully crossing the Hellespont, the two armies finally met in battle. Eumenes commanded an army that included local troops under the Persian satrap Pharnabazos III, alongside a certain Phoenix of Tenedos. His total force numbered approximately 20,000 troops, while Craterus and Neoptolemus commanded a similarly sized army of around 20,000. While the inclusion of Persian troops bolstered Eumenes' army, he was aware that many of his Macedonian soldiers held deep respect for Craterus, who was widely regarded as a skilled tactician. Craterus had played a key role on the left flank at the Battle of Ipsus, participated in Alexander's campaigns across Asia, and commanded the rear at the Battle of the Hydaspes. Although his actions in the Lamian War were not widely known among the Eastern troops, his reputation as an exceptional general was undisputed. Eumenes realized that his soldiers might hesitate to fight their fellow Macedonians, so he devised a cunning strategy. Eumenes deceived his men by claiming they would be facing Neoptolemus, whom they already despised as a traitor, rather than Craterus. He then positioned the Thracians and Asians, who had no loyalty or admiration for Craterus, on his left flank as cavalry, directly opposite Craterus's right wing. Eumenes arranged his long battle line with a small contingent of Macedonian phalangists at the core, flanked by mercenary troops. He personally took command of the right flank alongside the Cappadocians, who had grown to respect him. Craterus, meanwhile, positioned himself at the head of his elite companions on the right flank, with the main body of his Macedonian infantry forming a pike phalanx in the center. Neoptolemus commanded the left flank, facing Eumenes with his cavalry. At the onset of the battle, Craterus led his flank forward, but at that moment, Eumenes launched a coordinated assault from both flanks. The Thracians and Asians charged into Craterus's forces, while Eumenes personally engaged Neoptolemus. The distance between them ensured that Eumenes's troops could not hear Craterus's voice, preventing any hesitation or wavering in their attack. Craterus met his demise that day, either by falling from his horse and being trampled or succumbing to the ferocity of the cavalry engagement. His death caused his cavalry flank to collapse in disarray. Meanwhile, on the opposite flank, Eumenes and Neoptolemus fought fiercely, seeking each other out in the chaos. Eventually, they clashed in single combat, and the more experienced Eumenes emerged victorious, slaying Neoptolemus. With both enemy commanders dead, the opposing Macedonian forces were thrown into disarray. Eumenes extended an offer of amnesty to the surviving enemy troops, many of whom initially accepted. However, their loyalty quickly wavered, and they ultimately fled toward Antipater's camp. By late 321 BC, Perdiccas sought to return Alexander's body to Macedonia, the traditional burial place of the Macedonian royal family. However, as the remains passed through Syria, Ptolemy, the satrap of Egypt, bribed the escort and seized them, bringing Alexander's body to Memphis, Egypt. This act enraged Perdiccas, who saw it as an unacceptable insult and decided to invade Egypt to reclaim the body and restore order. Assembling his forces in Babylon, Perdiccas marched westward. Anticipating the invasion, Ptolemy used Egypt's well-organized bureaucracy to fortify the Nile's eastern border. Perdiccas advanced through Syria and Palestine before reaching the Sinai Peninsula. By 321 BC, he had arrived near Pelusium, the easternmost Nile outpost, where Ptolemy's forces awaited him. Ptolemaic troops were stationed along the river's edge, ready to repel any crossing attempt, while the bulk of Ptolemy's army remained mobile, prepared to reinforce any threatened sector. Perdiccas struggled to find a suitable crossing point, as Ptolemy shadowed his movements from across the river. Realizing that prolonged conflict could lead to further uprisings and destabilization, Perdiccas decided to attempt a covert river crossing under the cover of darkness. After marching overnight, his forces reached Camel's Rampart, a fort lightly garrisoned as part of Ptolemy's defensive strategy. Perdiccas launched an assault with his Indian elephants leading the charge, followed by the elite silver shields carrying scaling ladders. He positioned himself at the rear with the cavalry, confident in his plan. However, Ptolemy had already anticipated the attack and reinforced the garrison in time. Despite repeated waves of attack, the garrison held firm, inflicting heavy casualties on both sides. Seeing no alternative, Perdiccas retreated and searched for another crossing further south. Eventually, he reached Memphis, where an island in the Nile seemed to offer a potential crossing. Perdiccas deployed his elephants to stabilize the current, while his cavalry attempted to secure the passage. Initially, some of his troops successfully reached the island, but the shifting river sands made footing treacherous. The elephants and horses struggled, and many were forced to retreat. Trapped between the strong currents and the shore, a significant portion of his force became stranded. When Perdiccas ordered them to return through the deeper part of the river, many drowned. With his campaign in disarray, Perdiccas' troops, frustrated by the failure and heavy losses, turned against him. His officers, Paethon, Antigonus, and Seleucus, murdered him. The remainder of his army promptly defected to Ptolemy. In the aftermath, Ptolemy came to terms with Perdiccas' killers, appointing Paethon and Aridaeus as regents. However, a new agreement was soon reached at the Treaty of Triparadisus, where Antipater became the empire's regent. The two kings, Philip III and Alexander IV, were moved to Macedonia. Antigonus was appointed strategos of Asia and retained control over Phrygia, Lycia, and Pamphylia. With Lycaonia added to his territories, Ptolemy kept Egypt, Lysimachus retained Thrace, and Perdiccas' former allies, Seleucus, Paethon, and Antigonus, received Babylonia, Media, and Susiana, respectively. Despite Perdiccas' death, his cause was not entirely extinguished. Eumenes remained a formidable force, alongside other loyalist commanders such as Alcetas, Attalus, Docimos, and Polemon, who had gathered armies in Asia Minor. Thus the struggle for Alexander's empire was far from over. In 319 BC, after receiving reinforcements from Antipater's European army, Antigonus launched a campaign against Eumenes, marching to face him at the Battle of Orcynia. Both commanders likely deployed traditional formations, with cavalry positioned on the flanks and Macedonian phalanxes holding the center. However, Antigonus cleverly extended his phalanx by halving its depth, creating the illusion of a significantly larger force. This tactical deception misled Eumenes into believing that Antigonus had received even more reinforcements. As the armies prepared for battle, Eumenes suffered yet another setback. Apollonides, one of his cavalry commanders, defected to Antigonus, further weakening his position. When the battle commenced, the Antigonid forces overwhelmed the Eumenidean army, inflicting devastating losses. Eumenes and his remaining troops narrowly escaped and retreated eastward to the fortress of Nora. Along the way, Antigonus pursued him relentlessly, but Eumenes managed to evade further engagements. Eventually, he reached the safety of Nora, where he took refuge behind its well-fortified walls. Antigonus maintained a close watch over the stronghold, but the fortress was well-stocked and nearly impenetrable. Unable to breach its defenses, he left a subordinate in charge of the siege and redirected the bulk of his army to confront the remnants of Perdiccas' faction, who had entrenched themselves near the town of Cretopolis. Alcetas, along with his allies, Attalos, Docimos, and Polemon, had been gathering their forces in an attempt to establish a foothold in Anatolia. They had fortified a key mountain pass near Cretopolis, preparing for battle. Antigonus, leading an army of 40,000 infantry, 7,000 cavalry, and 200 war elephants, marched against them. In contrast, Alcetas commanded a force of approximately 20,000 troops. According to Diodorus, Antigonus's army traversed most of Anatolia in just 7 days, an extraordinary feat of endurance and discipline. Their rapid advance completely took the enemy by surprise. The first sign of their arrival was the blaring of elephant trumpets, which sent a wave of panic through Alcetas' ranks as they realized the battle was already lost. Seizing the high ground, Antigonus positioned his forces strategically. Both he and Docimos formed their phalanxes, while Alcetas, commanding the cavalry and peltasts, attempted to secure a ridge to gain an advantage. However, Antigonus quickly countered by leading a charge of 6,000 cavalry, down the hill at breakneck speed. The two cavalry units clashed violently, and Alcetus was swiftly defeated. He ordered a retreat, but his forces sustained heavy losses as they fell back toward the phalanx. With the Antigonid army closing in, the remnants of the Perdican troops had no time to form a proper defensive line. Faced with no viable options, they made a desperate decision. They surrendered. Alcetas, refusing to capitulate, fled with a group of Pisidian allies to the city of Termessos. However, the local inhabitants, fearing repercussions, sought to hand him over to Antigonus. Rather than face capture, Alcetus took his own life. With his death, the Perdican resistance was crushed. Meanwhile, Eumenes remained besieged in Nora, trapped but determined to survive. Despite being vastly outnumbered, he maintained high morale among his men by enforcing a strict training regimen, even setting up makeshift gyms to keep his troops in peak condition. Antigonus, despite his military strength, struggled to breach the fortress. The siege dragged on for over a year, during which both sides engaged in negotiations. Ultimately, a deal was proposed, and messengers were dispatched to Macedonia with the terms of a potential peace agreement for Eumenes. Antigonus, recognizing Eumenes' strategic brilliance, was hesitant to execute him, considering the possibility of securing him as an ally. The messengers journeyed to Macedonia, where Antipater had returned, accompanied by his son Cassander, his ally Polyperchon, and the family of Alexander the Great, including his widow Roxana and young son Alexander IV. Barcine, another of Alexander's former consorts, was likely in Pergamon at this time. However, upon reaching Pella, the messengers were met with unexpected and shocking news. Antipater had died at the age of 81. In his final decision, he had chosen Polyperchon, rather than his own son Cassander, as his successor and regent. Cassander, furious at being overlooked, refused to accept the decision and demanded power for himself. With tensions rising, the fragile balance of power collapsed, setting the stage for the Second War of the Diadochi, as new alliances and rivalries emerged in the struggle for control over Alexander's fragmented empire. Following the conclusion of the First War of the Diadochi and the post-war stabilization efforts, led by Antigonus in Asia Minor, it initially appeared that the Macedonian Empire was on course for a period of peace and prosperity. However, the death of Antipater in 319 BC brought an unexpected turn of events. With Antipater's passing, his regency was handed over to his lieutenant Polyperchon, rather than his son Cassander, which set the stage for inevitable conflict. Both Cassander and Polyperchon began to gather allies in a bid to eliminate one another and secure their positions as the sole regent of the empire. Cassander, who had few allies left in Pella, fled Macedonia and sought refuge in the court of Antigonus. He also secured support from Ptolemy, the new ruler of Egypt, who agreed to lend him assistance. On the other hand, Polyperchon forged an alliance with Eumenes, preparing for a confrontation with Cassander and Antigonus. Eumenes, who had been holed up in the fortress of Nora, had initially been in talks with Antipater. However, upon hearing of his death and the onset of the civil war, Eumenes seized the opportunity to slip away. Marching through the once stronghold of Cappadocia, he raised a small army and made his way to the royal treasury in Cilicia, where he utilized its funds to recruit additional mercenaries. He also garnered the loyalty of 6,000 of Alexander's veteran soldiers stationed in the province. In the spring of 317 BC, Eumenes and his forces marched to Phoenicia, where he assembled a naval force on behalf of Polyperchon. In Asia, at the beginning of 318 BC, Arrhidaeus, the governor of Hellespontine Phrygia, attempted to seize the city of Cyzicus. Antigonus, as strategos of Asia, interpreted this as a challenge to his authority and sent a force to counter Arrhidaeus. Meanwhile, Antigonus personally led an army into Lydia to confront the local governor, Clytus the White, who had managed to hold the province. Clytus ultimately fled to Macedonia, joining Polyperchon, who was marching southward to force the Greek cities to align with his cause against Cassander and Antigonus. Polyperchon, positioning himself as a defender of the freedom of the Greek city-states from Macedonian domination, encountered unexpected resistance. First, he marched to Athens in an attempt to seize the fortress of Munichia, but was thwarted by the timely arrival of Cassander with his naval forces. Polyperchon then moved south to Megalopolis, a city governed by Damis, who refused to submit to Polyperchon's rule. Damis likely rejected Polyperchon's claims of supporting democratic city-states, which led to a standoff. Polyperchon assembled a force of 24,000 infantry, 65 war elephants, and 1,000 cavalry, initiating a siege of Athens in the meantime. Upon arriving at Megalopolis, Polyperchon's forces laid siege to the city, deploying towers and sapper tunnels to breach its defenses. The local militia, numbering around 15,000 soldiers and led by Damis, managed to hold the attackers at bay for some time. Eventually, however, Polyperchon's forces broke through a section of the wall. In an overzealous display of confidence, Polyperchon ordered his troops to flood the city. However, the defenders swiftly detected the breach and sealed it with their spears. After suffering heavy losses, attackers were forced to retreat, and the defenders repaired the walls, setting up traps outside the city to prevent another attack. Polyperchon, enraged by the failure, called for the deployment of war elephants to break through the city's defenses. Damis allowed the elephants to advance into the makeshift breach, but had his forces place traps around the elephants. The defenders showered the elephants with arrows, causing them to panic and trample their own forces, throwing Polyperchon's troops into disarray. After failing again, Polyperchon retreated. The siege of Athens also ended in failure when Cassander's forces triumphed, securing the favor of the Athenians. Soon after, Antigonus decisively destroyed the fleet that Eumenes had raised for Polyperchon at the Battle of Byzantium. With his campaign thwarted, Polyperchon was forced to abandon his efforts and flee Macedonia. He found refuge in Epirus, where he joined forces with Olympias, the mother of Alexander the Great, Roxana, and the infant Alexander. Together they formed an alliance with King Aeacides of Epirus and launched an invasion into Macedonia. Initially, Olympias was successful, defeating one of Cassander's armies, which was under the leadership of the disabled Philip III. She had him murdered but was soon confronted by Cassander, who returned from the Peloponnesus, decisively defeating her forces. Olympias was executed in 316 BC, and Roxana, along with her son, was taken into Cassander's custody. Meanwhile, Antigonus had consolidated his hold over the satrapies he had captured and now focused his attention on Eumenes. Eumenes hastily withdrew from Phoenicia and marched eastward to rally support in the eastern provinces. His efforts were successful, with most of the eastern satraps joining his cause, which significantly strengthened his army. Eumenes led his newly expanded forces through Mesopotamia, Babylonia, Susiana, and Media, until the two armies finally met at Perdiccas. Antigonus's army, at full strength, consisted of 28,000 heavy infantry, 5,500 light infantry, 6,900 light cavalry, 3,700 heavy cavalry, and 65 war elephants. Eumenes, on the other hand, commanded 17,000 heavy infantry, 18,000 light infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and 125 war elephants. In terms of deployment, Eumenes placed his left flank under the command of Eudamos, with cavalry support, protected by a lancer vanguard. His center was made up of his heavy infantry, with the silver shields positioned on the right flank, supported by Eumenes himself and his remaining cavalry. The elephants and light infantry were deployed in alternating formations in front of the flanks. Antigonus deployed his light cavalry under Paethon on the left flank, with most of the elephants placed on the right flank alongside his son Demetrios, who commanded the elite Agema cavalry. Antigonus placed the rest of his elephants in the center and left flanks. Antigonus began by advancing his right flank, while holding his left flank in reserve due to its lighter armament. The terrain on the enemy's right flank was elevated, but Paethon was ordered to move forward, as this was the only portion of the battlefield where a flank attack could occur. Paethon used javelins and arrows to harass Eumenes' elephants, prompting Eumenes to order his light cavalry to emerge and counterattack. After a fierce skirmish, Eumenes' cavalry forced Paethon's troops to retreat, and a contingent of elephants followed, trapping them in the foothills. The battle raged on in the center, with both armies colliding in a fierce engagement. The Eumenes force had an advantage thanks to the experienced Silver Shields, who, despite their advanced age, were veterans of both Philip's and Alexander's campaigns. Their experience and skill helped break the Antigonid phalanx. However, Antigonus wasn't easily deterred and counterattacked with overwhelming force, eventually overcoming the Eumenes' left flank. Despite Antigonus's success on his own flank, Eumenes triumphed in the overall battle. Eumenes lost only 540 infantry, a few cavalry, and had 900 wounded, while Antigonus suffered heavier losses: 3,700 infantry killed, 54 cavalry, and 4,000 wounded. With his army's morale broken, Antigonus withdrew from the field after nightfall, and Eumenes retreated to his winter quarters, expecting no further challenges. Antigonus retreated into Media, while Eumenes moved to winter in Gabiene. Meanwhile, Antigonus concocted a plan to surprise Eumenes. He marched through the bitter winter of 316 BC, navigating harsh terrain and blizzard conditions. Somehow, Eumenes learned of this plan, quickly organizing his forces for a battle. The two armies clashed on the open fields of Gabiene. Antigonus's forces comprised 22,000 heavy infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 65 war elephants. In contrast, Eumenes commanded 36,700 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and 114 elephants. The vast, open plains provided ideal conditions for large-scale formation combat. Antigonus positioned Paethon with the cavalry on the left flank, while he and Demetrios took command of the right, leading their most elite troops. The center was occupied by cavalry, with the elephants deployed as a vanguard at the front. On the opposing side, Eumenes positioned himself on the left flank, directing the cavalry while placing the formidable silver shields beside him. The rest of his infantry extended along the line, with the elephants similarly spread out at the front. His right flank was reinforced with light cavalry and additional elephants for support. Eumenes initiated the battle by ordering his elephants in the left and center to advance, while he and his troops pushed forward behind them. The advancing beasts stirred up massive clouds of dust, reducing visibility and blinding his own cavalry. Antigonus quickly seized the opportunity, sending a contingent of his light cavalry through the cover of the dust storm. They bypassed the front lines, and reached the baggage train of Eumenes' forces, swiftly seizing it. Meanwhile, Eumenes pressed into Antigonus's ranks, but his charge failed to break them. Successors, who had been part of the attack, lost confidence in their chances and withdrew with his troops, leaving Eumenes exposed to hold the line alone. At that moment, the Silver Shields arrived in force, advancing behind the elephants and smashing into Antigonus's infantry, shattering sections of their formation. The battlefield plunged into chaos, forcing both sides to pull back to their respective camps, ending the engagement in a stalemate. As night descended, Eumenes sought to rally his disheartened troops for the next day's battle. However, news of the stolen baggage train spread throughout the camp, igniting outrage among the soldiers. At this critical moment, the Silver Shields, who had long harbored distrust toward Eumenes due to his southern Greek origins rather than Macedonian heritage, rose in revolt. Upon discovering that Antigonus had seized their families, servants, and spoils of war, they secretly initiated negotiations with him. An agreement was swiftly reached. In exchange for the return of their baggage and loved ones, the Silver Shields would deliver Eumenes and pledge their allegiance to Antigonus. Without hesitation, they arrested Eumenes along with his senior officers and handed them over. Antigonus wasted no time. Eumenes was swiftly executed. With Eumenes' death, the war in the eastern provinces of the empire came to an end. Following the conflict, Cassander established his dominance over Macedonia, bordering the territories of Lysimachos in Thrace. Meanwhile, a vast domain encompassing Egypt, Cyrene, Syria, Libya, Cyprus, and several islands fell under Ptolemy's control. Antigonus, now ruling all of Persia and Asia Minor, emerged as the unrivaled power in Asia. His growing influence alarmed the other Diadochi, and within a year, the Third War of the Diadochi erupted. The year was 315 BC, and Antigonus stood as one of the most dominant figures across Eurasia. Emerging victorious from the Second War of the Diadochi, he now reigned over a vast domain, stretching from Bithynia to Bactria. However, in Macedonia and Thrace, his former allies, Cassander and Lysimachos, viewed his growing power with suspicion. Their concerns led them to engage in secret negotiations with Ptolemy in Egypt, with the possibility of Alexander's empire being reunited once more. Antigonus focused on strengthening his grip over the eastern provinces. In 314 BC, he executed Paethon, suspecting him of amassing too much influence, and annexed Media into his expanding realm. Continuing his advance southward, he captured the treasuries of Susa before leading his forces into Babylon. Upon his arrival, he was initially received with warmth by Seleucus, the region's governor. However, tensions soon escalated between the two, forcing Seleucus to flee to Egypt, where he later joined Ptolemy. Though Antigonus appeared to have secured his authority on the surface, many of the satraps remained unwilling to submit to his rule over Asia. In response, a powerful coalition formed in 314 BC, consisting of Cassander, Lysimachos, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. The coalition presented Antigonus with an ultimatum, demanding that he redistribute Babylon's treasury wealth and disband his army. Complying with these terms would have effectively led to a fresh division of Alexander's empire. Lysimachos sought control over Hellespontine Phrygia, Cassander desired Cappadocia and Lycia, Seleucus demanded the return of Babylon, and Ptolemy claimed Syria. Justifying their demands, they cited their alliance against Eumenes, arguing they deserved a fairer share. Predictably, Antigonus outright rejected these terms, responding with a declaration of war through messengers. Thus, in 314 BC, conflict erupted once again. Despite his enemies taking the diplomatic initiative, it was Antigonus who struck first, targeting the Near Eastern territories under Ptolemy's control. His actions violated the Triparadisos Agreement, a crucial pact for launching any campaigns into Asia Minor or Persia. As with previous wars, this one also commenced with political maneuvering stretching across continents. Antigonus launched a siege on Tyre, mirroring Alexander's famous assault decades earlier. However, Ptolemy's naval forces continuously supplied the city, prolonging the conflict. The campaign lasted over a year, culminating in the devastating fall of Tyre, granting Antigonus full control over Phoenicia and most of Syria. Meanwhile, Ptolemy, Cassander, and Lysimachus orchestrated a rebellion against Antigonus, led by Assander, one of his own subordinates who ruled Ionia and parts of Asia Minor. To counter this new front, Antigonus dispatched his nephew Ptolemy to suppress Assander's uprising. At the same time, he issued promises of autonomy to the Greek poleis, aiming to sway them against his opponents. Not to be outmaneuvered, Ptolemy responded by making his own pledge of security to the Greek city-states, hoping to undermine Antigonus's influence. Assander, having expanded his domain into Lydia and parts of Cappadocia, gained significant backing from the coalition as the war intensified. Ptolemy's strategy focused on severing Assander's access to Lysimachus and Cassander, ensuring they could not reinforce him by land. Executing this plan effectively, the young general successfully reclaimed the entirety of Cappadocia. He then advanced into Bithynia before turning south to threaten Caria, where he secured a decisive victory over Eupolemus, a commander loyal to Cassander. Despite his success in isolating Assander and cutting him off from his allies, Ptolemy lacked the manpower and supplies to launch a sustained offensive. As a result, he dismissed his troops to winter quarters. Cassander, struggling to maintain control, sought negotiations. The freedom declarations had sparked revolts across the Peloponnese, fueled by Polyperchon. Meanwhile, Ptolemy continued to provide naval assistance. However, the Phoenicians had built a formidable fleet, allowing Antigonus to achieve naval supremacy in the Aegean. Seizing the opportunity, Antigonus withdrew his main army from Syria and marched against Assander, entrusting the defense of the Levant to his eldest son, Demetrius. Alongside Demetrius were Paethon of Agenor and Nearchos, Alexander's former admiral. Upon reaching Asia Minor, Antigonus waged a successful campaign against Assander, ultimately forcing him into a peace agreement. As terms of the treaty, Assander was compelled to surrender his army, cede control of Caria, and offer up his own brother as a hostage. Meanwhile, Ptolemy mustered his Egyptian and Macedonian forces, advancing through the Sinai Peninsula toward Gaza. Demetrius, despite being advised against facing such seasoned generals, was determined to protect his father's newly acquired territories. Without hesitation, he led his forces through Syria and Judea, preparing for a decisive confrontation in Gaza. The battle unfolded in a field situated between the Besor River and Gaza itself. Commanding a significant force, Ptolemy and Seleucus led 18,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry. Facing them, Demetrios had 12,500 infantry, 4,400 cavalry, and 43 war elephants. The battlefield deployment was as follows. The Antigonid left flank was guarded by 3,000 cavalry, commanded by Demetrios and his advisors. In front of them stood 30 Indian elephants, flanked by 1,500 light infantry armed with bows. In the center of the line, an 11,000-strong phalanx was positioned. The remaining 13 elephants were arrayed at the front. On the right flank, the remaining 1,500 cavalry were stationed. Initially, Ptolemy and Seleucus had intended to place their cavalry on their left flank, but upon observing the enemy's arrangement, they adjusted their tactics, placing 3,000 cavalry on their right. To counter the threat of an elephant charge, Ptolemy had his engineers lay metal spikes across the field, with javelin throwers positioned nearby. The center was packed with 18,000 infantrymen, and about 1,000 cavalry was stationed on the left flank. The battle began with Demetrios charging forward at the head of his cavalry in a swift, lightning-like assault. In response, Seleucus and Ptolemy sent their cavalry to meet the charge head-on. This left Demetrios' right wing exposed, giving Seleucus and Ptolemy the opportunity to outflank the inexperienced Demetrios. Cavalry battle raged for an extended period, with many brave soldiers falling, but it ended with no clear victor. At this point, Demetrios ordered his elephants to charge in an attempt to overwhelm the enemy. The majestic creatures advanced, but their momentum was soon halted by Ptolemy's light cavalry, which unleashed a barrage of javelins and arrows upon the elephants. The elephant handlers fought valiantly against this onslaught, but they were ultimately thwarted by the metal spikes on the battlefield. In the end, almost all the elephants were either killed or captured, and their handlers perished as well. Seeing this catastrophic loss, the morale of the Antigonid forces plummeted, and chaos ensued. Many soldiers fled back toward Gaza, and despite Demetrios' desperate attempts to rally them, the retreat turned into a disorganized rout. Demetrios eventually ordered his troops to pull back, but the confusion within the ranks made it impossible to withdraw in an orderly fashion. As a result, Ptolemy and Seleucus encircled the remaining Antigonid forces, trapping them and capturing over 8,000 soldiers, while the rest were killed. Demetrios, having lost his honor, managed to escape the field, returning to Phoenicia. After his defeat, Demetrios retreated northward to Tripolis, where he began rebuilding his army. He also sent a report to his father, who had just concluded his campaign in Caria, urging him to send reinforcements. Meanwhile, Seleucus convinced Ptolemy to release him from service and grant him an army of 1,000 troops. With this force, Seleucus aimed to retake his former province of Babylonia, which had been left without a governor following the death of Paethon in battle. Ptolemy continued his pursuit of Demetrios, advancing as far north as Sidon. However, he soon received word that Antigonus was returning from Asia Minor with his main army, forcing Ptolemy to withdraw from Syria. Antigonus returned to Coele-Syria with an army of 80,000 men and swiftly reclaimed the Phoenician coastline. In the east, Seleucus had been steadily recruiting soldiers on his way to Babylon, amassing a force of around 3,000 troops. Upon finally reaching Babylon, he was warmly welcomed into the city and quickly recognized as the new ruler. He encountered little resistance, save for Paethon's former commander, Diphilus, who had barricaded himself and other Antigonid supporters inside the city's fortress. However, Seleucus swiftly laid siege to the fortress, successfully reoccupying Babylon. Afterward, he freed friends who had been imprisoned there and began organizing his government, marking the traditional beginning of the Seleucid Empire. Antigonus, aware of the impending challenges in the east, initiated negotiations with Cassander and Lysimachus. Meanwhile, his satraps, Nicanor of Media and Euagoras of Aria, assembled 17,000 troops and began moving toward him. Buoyed by his victory in Babylon, Seleucus gathered 3,000 infantry and 400 cavalry, advancing into the marshes of the Tigris to intercept the two satraps before they could unite with Antigonus. When Nicanor and Euagoras arrived at the banks of the Tigris, they were unaware that Seleucus was still nearby. He ordered his men to set up camp for the night, waiting until darkness fell. Under the cover of night, Seleucus attacked Nicanor's poorly defended stockade, launching a massacre. In the chaos, Euagoras was killed, prompting the Persian soldiers under his command to switch allegiances. Nicanor, with only a few remaining allies, fled, leaving Seleucus in control of Media and Elam. As turmoil continued in the east, Antigonus was preoccupied with diplomatic negotiations. Ptolemy joined the discussions with the other Diadochi, resulting in the formation of the Peace of the Dynasts. According to the terms of the treaty, Cassander received Macedonia and Thessaly, along with the right to garrison Greek cities, which were now considered independent by all parties. Lysimachus retained control of Thrace, while Ptolemy solidified his hold over Cyprus and Egypt. Antigonus, meanwhile, retained control of the rest, with his stronghold in Phoenicia, Asia Minor, and Syria. It was also agreed that Alexander IV, son of Roxana and Alexander III, would take the throne once he came of age. However, fearing that the son of the great conqueror would become a threat to his own rule, Cassander secretly ordered his assassination and had his body concealed. Thus, the last of the Argead dynasty, the son of Alexander and grandson of Philip, was lost to history. Roxana, too, was killed. Cassander kept these deaths secret, claiming to rule as a regent for Alexander's bloodline, rather than openly as a usurper. One key figure was notably excluded from the Peace of the Dynasts: Seleucus, who had now assumed the title of Nicator, or the Victorious. He had taken control of Aria and Persia, with only Sogdiana and Bactria left outside his reach. Though the Third War of the Diadochi had come to an end, the balance of power between the former generals of Alexander remained highly volatile. Antigonus, determined to conquer the East once again, began preparing to retake Babylon, while Seleucus spread rumors that Alexander himself had appeared to him in a dream, declaring him king. The tension between the two was palpable, and with sabers rattling, war seemed inevitable once more. As the Third War of the Diadochi came to an end, no one yet knew that Cassander had secretly murdered Alexander's heir. The generals had managed to construct a fragile peace among themselves, but tensions simmered beneath the surface. Antigonus, now the ruler of Asia Minor and the Levant, had successfully secured his borders against Ptolemy to the south, and Cassander and Lysimachus to the west. However, a new and unexpected power was rising in the east. Seleucus, now bearing the title Nicator, the Victorious, was systematically conquering the vast and wealthy lands of Persia. This was an affront that Antigonus could not tolerate. A clash between the two was inevitable, and Babylon would become the decisive battleground for control of Persia and Mesopotamia. Seleucus embarked on an ambitious campaign to consolidate power in the east. With Nicanor's army defeated, no other force remained to oppose him. His strategy was not solely based on conquest, but also on forging alliances with friendly satraps, ensuring that his control was both military and diplomatic. Alarmed by Seleucus's growing influence, Antigonus dispatched his son, Demetrios, to Babylon to reassert control. Demetrios arrived at the head of an army 19,000 strong, determined to wrest the city from Seleucus's grasp. In Seleucus's absence, the defense of Babylon was entrusted to his loyal commander, Patrocles, who commanded a modest garrison, likely numbering a few thousand men. Demetrios reached Babylon in early spring of 310 BC. The city's defenses were unconventional. Rather than relying on a single fortified perimeter, Babylon was defended by two strong fortresses where Seleucus had stationed his forces. Furthermore, the civilian population had been evacuated, and the surrounding terrain of swamps, canals, and rivers provided natural defensive barriers. Demetrios laid siege to the fortresses and successfully captured one, but the second proved a more formidable challenge. Rather than committing further resources, Demetrios left his lieutenant, Archelaus, to continue the siege, while he returned west, leaving 6,000 troops to hold the city. Meanwhile, Seleucus had solidified his control over large portions of Persia. With the support of local satraps, he assembled a formidable army and marched westward to reclaim his capital. Upon his arrival, Seleucus swiftly drove Archelaus from the city, re-establishing his authority. Recognizing the growing threat, Antigonus resolved to confront Seleucus personally. If Seleucus were allowed to further entrench himself, he could threaten Antigonus's dominion over the east. With this in mind, Antigonus mustered a massive army of 75,000 men and set out for Babylon in the autumn of 310 BC. By January of 309 BC, Antigonus's forces reached the outskirts of Babylon. Unlike the previous engagement, Seleucus opted for a different defensive strategy. Instead of retreating into the citadel, his forces occupied and fortified the entire city, leaving no portion undefended. From his command center, within the citadel, Seleucus orchestrated Babylon's defense as Antigonus laid siege to the city. The battle commenced with fierce fighting as Antigonus' troops broke through the outer defenses and stormed the city streets. Despite being vastly outnumbered, Seleucus' forces resisted stubbornly, retreating gradually toward the citadel. Antigonus launched repeated assaults on the citadel, but failed to breach its defenses, facing mounting casualties and realizing a decisive victory was unattainable. Antigonus withdrew his army from the city and took to the countryside. Assessing the precarious situation, Seleucus decided to conduct a tactical retreat, abandoning Babylon in a calculated move to regroup and adjust his strategy. With Seleucus gone, Antigonus declared himself the master of Babylon. To solidify his hold over the region, he installed Archelaus as satrap, tasked with bringing order to the volatile territory. Despite this temporary setback, Seleucus refused to concede defeat. Antigonus embarked on a campaign of devastation, pillaging and burning much of the surrounding land. This forced Seleucus, who had been relying on guerrilla tactics to compensate for his smaller force, to abandon his strategy of attrition and face Antigonus in open battle. In August of 309 BC, the two armies met on the battlefield. Antigonus sought to overwhelm Seleucus with sheer numbers, aiming for a decisive victory. However, Seleucus masterfully utilized the terrain to prevent the Antigonid army from outflanking him. The battle raged throughout the day, yet neither side managed to gain a clear advantage. As night fell, both armies withdrew to their camps. Antigonus' men disarmed and slept, while Seleucus ordered his troops to remain ready and rest in formation. At dawn, before the Antigonid troops could properly rouse themselves, Seleucus launched a surprise attack. His well-organized phalanx surged forward, catching the enemy completely unprepared. The Antigonid army was swiftly thrown into chaos and routed. The battle ended in utter defeat for Antigonus, who suffered heavy losses. He barely managed to escape with a fraction of his forces, retreating from Babylonia to Syria. With his triumph secured, Seleucus re-entered Babylon as its undisputed ruler. Despite this crushing defeat, Antigonus was not yet finished. Though he had lost nearly two-thirds of his empire, his power remained formidable. The fragile balance of power among the Diadochi was about to be shattered once more, as the rival kings prepared for what would be the most devastating and consequential war yet. A war that would bring both unprecedented destruction and remarkable triumphs. The Antigonids' defeat in the Babylonian War resulted in the loss of the east to Seleucus. Despite this setback, Antigonus remained at the height of his power. After returning to Syria, he set his sights on renewing war against the Western coalition, leading to a decisive battle that would forever alter history. Meanwhile, from Egypt, Ptolemy focused on securing his naval dominance, ensuring the Antigonid fleet would never challenge him again. He moved to consolidate control over Cyprus, an island whose city kingdoms held varying loyalties, a pattern dating back to the Ionian revolt. Some rulers, such as Nicocreon of Salamis, modern-day Famagusta, welcomed him, while others, like the king of Marion in the Akamas forests, remained loyal to Antigonus. In response, Ptolemy razed Marion and dismantled Cyprus's city kingdoms, appointing Nicocreon as the island's governor. With Cyprus secured, Ptolemy turned to the Cyclades, where he guaranteed the independence of the island city-states and re-established the Nesiotic League, a confederation now loyal to him. He then landed in Corinth, proclaiming the autonomy of its cities, which directly threatened Cassander, for Corinth was under his control. Tensions between Ptolemy and Cassander escalated, but upon learning of Antigonus's struggles in the east, they opted for diplomacy. Ptolemy withdrew to Egypt, forming an alliance with Cassander and Lysimachus against Antigonus. Upon his return to Syria, Antigonus quickly recognized the strategic threat Cyprus posed if it remained under Ptolemaic control. However, fearing Cassander's intervention, he first turned his attention to the Aegean. To undermine Cassander, he sent Alexander the Great's illegitimate son, Heracles, and his mother, Barsine, to his former ally, Polyperchon, in the Peloponnese, hoping the old general would use the young heir to rally opposition against Cassander. But Cassander convinced Polyperchon to side with him, leading to the murder of Heracles and Barsine. With his diplomatic maneuver failing, Antigonus took direct action in 308 BC, ordering his son, Demetrius, to advance into Greece and assert control over the Hellenic city-states. Eager to restore their dominance after the Babylonian defeat, Antigonus and Demetrius preemptively invaded Greece, capitalizing on the widespread anti-Macedonian sentiment among the Poles. Crossing from Asia Minor into the Aegean, Demetrius arrived in Athens, expelling the Macedonian garrison and its governor, Demetrius of Phaleron. In gratitude, the Athenians reinstated their democracy, pledged loyalty to Antigonus, and began rebuilding their navy. They also honored Antigonus and Demetrius with the title Theoi Soteres, Savior Gods. The success of Demetrius's campaign sparked widespread rebellion against Cassander, significantly weakening his control. It would take him 4 years to restore order in Greece, leaving him unable to assist Ptolemy, who now had to face Antigonus's aggression alone. Antigonus's next objective was the strategically vital island of Cyprus. Capturing it would not only deal a severe blow to Ptolemy's prestige, but also hinder his ability to launch raids into Asia Minor. In the spring of 306 BC, Demetrius, following his father's orders, set sail from Athens with a formidable force. Cyprus's importance was immense. It was a gateway to both Asia Minor and Egypt, making it a prime location for launching naval operations. Ptolemy's power on the island was concentrated in Salamis, governed by his brother Menelaus. Demetrius landed on Carpasia in the northeast, swiftly capturing the cities of Carpasia and Urania. He left his fleet stationed at the peninsula's tip while Menelaus, determined to prevent Demetrius from reaching Salamis, led his forces out to meet him in open battle 5 miles from the city. The clash was brief but decisive, Menelaus suffered a defeat and retreated behind Salamis' walls, where Demetrius laid siege, blockading the port with his fleet. Recognizing the urgency, Menelaus called for reinforcements from his brother. Ptolemy personally set sail from Alexandria, leading a grand fleet of 140 warships and 10,000 troops aboard 200 transports. He gathered additional reinforcements along the way before arriving in Kition. There he instructed Menelaus to send his fleet out of Salamis to join him, believing their combined forces would be too great for Demetrius to handle. However, Demetrius learned of Ptolemy's plan and acted swiftly. He dispatched 10 ships to reinforce the blockade at Salamis' harbor entrance, preventing Menelaus' fleet from escaping. By morning, when no Ptolemaic ships emerged, Ptolemy realized his strategy had failed. Left with no choice, he prepared for a direct confrontation. Ptolemy sailed around Cape Pedalion to engage Demetrius, who positioned his fleet strategically. On the left flank, he deployed his heaviest warships in a double line, placing himself at the front. The center and right were formed in a single line. Ptolemy mirrored this formation, hoping to break Demetrius' right flank first and encircle his forces. Tension filled the air as both sides braced for battle. Then Demetrius and his admiral, Medeos, launched their assault. The Antigonid left clashed fiercely with the Ptolemaic right, where Demetrius' siege-equipped warships battered the enemy, quickly breaking through. Meanwhile, Ptolemy's left advanced rapidly, shattering the Antigonid right. However, Demetrius' victorious left flank turned inward, striking the enemy's center. At the same time, Menelaus' ships attempted to break through the blockade. Ptolemy, seeing his center on the verge of collapse, turned to rally his forces, only to realize his fleet was already in full retreat. Accepting defeat, he withdrew from the battle. By the time Menelaus managed to breach the blockade, Ptolemy had already abandoned the fight. The Battle of Salamis ended in a resounding Antigonid victory. Demetrius captured 40 warships and 100 supply vessels from Ptolemy's forces. Menelaus fled to Alexandria, while Salamis, now defenseless, surrendered. Over 16,000 infantry and 600 cavalry were taken prisoner, many of whom chose to join Demetrius's ranks. The Antigonid losses were minimal, only about 20 ships. But for Ptolemy and Menelaus, the defeat was far more significant. They had lost more than just a battle. They had lost Cyprus. When news of the triumph at Salamis reached Antigonus in Syria, he formally declared himself king, as the Macedonian throne had remained vacant since Cassander orchestrated the murder of Alexander IV of Macedon years earlier. At the same time, Demetrius was elevated to co-king alongside his father. This proclamation was quickly followed by other dynasts adopting royal titles. Following the naval victory at Salamis, Ptolemy's holdings were left largely exposed. With his entire fleet destroyed and his land forces significantly weakened, Antigonus seized the moment. He recalled Demetrius's navy and initiated plans for an invasion of Egypt. Thus, father and son set their sights on Egypt. Antigonus mustered 90,000 troops in his capital, while Demetrius gathered his fleet and set sail, moving southward from Asia Minor. Their forces advanced through the Levant toward Egypt. Eventually, they arrived at Pelusium, only to find Ptolemy stationed across the river with his army, fully prepared to resist them. Recalling Perdiccas' disastrous attempt to cross the Nile 15 years earlier, Antigonus opted against a direct assault and instead sought an alternative crossing further upstream. However, after assessing the risks, he decided to withdraw without engaging in battle. For the moment, Ptolemy's rule was secured. Despite this setback, the war was far from over. Though Antigonus and Demetrius controlled Asia Minor and the Levant, the island of Rhodes remained neutral while maintaining friendly ties with Ptolemy. Seeing this as an obstacle, Antigonus ordered Demetrius to sail forth and subdue the island. Demetrius landed at Rhodes in 305 BC, leading an army of approximately 40,000 troops. The Rhodians, by contrast, could only muster 6,000 citizen soldiers, 1,000 foreign mercenaries, and an unspecified number of enslaved laborers. To support the siege, Demetrius constructed his own harbor adjacent to the city's main port and established a fortified encampment for his primary force. However, Rhodes's formidable defenses made it difficult to enforce a full blockade, allowing supply ships to breach his lines and deliver reinforcements from other Diadochi factions. Recognizing the strategic importance of capturing the harbor, Demetrius launched multiple assaults, yet each failed to achieve meaningful success, forcing him to attempt a land-based offensive instead. Demetrius's forces successfully breached the walls, and a contingent managed to infiltrate the city. However, before they could consolidate their gains, the Rhodians launched a fierce counterattack, driving out the invaders and either killing or capturing them. Despite this opening, Demetrius refrained from pressing the assault, granting the defenders time to repair their fortifications. The siege dragged on for a year before Antigonus, recognizing its futility, ordered Demetrius to withdraw. In 304 BC, a peace treaty was brokered in which Rhodes pledged allegiance to Antigonus and Demetrius while maintaining its alliance with Ptolemy. Despite Antigonus's attempts to frame the campaign as a grand victory, its outcome was widely regarded as inconclusive. However, it did achieve one critical objective. Demetrius was now free to direct his forces against Cassander in Greece. By the autumn of 304 BC, Demetrius set sail for Greece. Cassander had spent the previous years reasserting his dominance over much of the region and was laying siege to Athens when Demetrius arrived. Forced to abandon the siege, Cassander withdrew northward as Demetrius pressed forward, liberating cities along the way. He swiftly secured Corinth and most of the Peloponnese, where he established a league of Greek cities modeled after the one formed by Philip II. Under its terms, the member states remained autonomous, though Demetrius was appointed their supreme general with the power to levy troops. Fearing that Demetrius's continued successes might undermine his rule entirely, Cassander sought peace in 302 BC. However, emboldened by his victories, Demetrius, alongside Antigonus, remained confident in their ability to force Cassander's total surrender, an outcome Cassander refused to accept. He thus convened with Lysimachus, and together they devised a plan to counter the Antigonid threat. They also reached out to Ptolemy and Seleucus, urging them to join their alliance against Antigonus. Taking the initiative, Cassander dispatched a substantial portion of his forces to support Lysimachus's invasion of Asia Minor, while he himself led the remaining Macedonian army into Thessaly to block Demetrius's advance. Near the town of Halos, the two forces engaged in a prolonged standoff, each constructing fortified camps and carefully observing the other without committing to battle. Meanwhile, in 302 BC, Lysimachus crossed the Hellespont, while Antigonus was occupied in Syria, aiming to overrun Asia Minor. His forces quickly seized the city of Sigaeon, compelling most of Troas to surrender, except for the strategically vital port of Abydos. While laying siege to Abydos, he dispatched Cassander's general Prepeleus to attack Ionia. Despite Demetrius's absence, his fleet successfully reinforced the defenders of Abydos, forcing Lysimachus to abandon the siege. Undeterred, Lysimachus continued south, capturing Dasilium and securing control over most of Hellespontine Phrygia before advancing deeper into Anatolia. At the same time, Prepolaus had conquered much of Ionia, culminating in the capture of Sardis, a crucial administrative center. When Antigonus learned of the invasion from his capital at Antigonia, he wasted no time and marched northward. Lysimachus, recognizing the danger of direct confrontation, opted for a defensive strategy, awaiting reinforcements from his allies. Upon reaching Lysimachus's position, Antigonus offered battle, but the opposing forces remained inside their fortified encampment. In response, Antigonus moved to cut off their supply lines, forcing Lysimachus to withdraw under the cover of night, retreating northward to Dorylaeum. There, he constructed a heavily fortified, triple-palisaded camp in the hills, ensuring access to fresh provisions. Antigonus, closely pursuing, laid siege to the new position. As food supplies dwindled and the siege works neared completion, Lysimachus once again executed a strategic withdrawal under the cover of a storm. Though Antigonus attempted to follow, worsening weather conditions and the onset of winter forced him to call off the pursuit. He instead dispersed his troops into winter quarters, while Lysimachus's army sought refuge in Heraclea, Bithynia. Meanwhile, to the east, Seleucus had launched a campaign in 305 BC, subjugating Stasnor and securing the vast territory of Bactria. Soon after, news reached him of Chandragupta Maurya's invasion of the Indus region. In response, Seleucus mounted an expedition to reclaim the lost lands west of the river. However, his campaign faltered upon encountering Chandragupta's formidable forces, leading to a treaty in 303 BC. Seleucus ceded the contested territories in exchange for stability along his eastern frontier and 500 Indian war elephants. With his eastern flank secure, Seleucus now turned his attention westward. Antigonus, meanwhile, had barely settled his troops for winter when reports arrived of Seleucus's imminent march to support Lysimachus. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Antigonus urgently recalled Demetrius, ordering him to reinforce the campaign in Asia. Hastily securing a truce with Cassander, Demetrius embarked across the Aegean, landing in Ephesus before marching north toward the Hellespont, where he too placed his forces in winter quarters. With Demetrius absent, Cassander saw an opportunity to send additional reinforcements to Lysimachus, entrusting the command to his brother, Pleistarchus. However, since Demetrius was closely guarding the main crossing points at the Hellespont and the Bosphorus, Pleistarchus attempted to transport his troops directly across the Black Sea to Heraclea. Due to a shortage of ships, the men had to be ferried in separate waves. The first group successfully reached their destination, but the second was intercepted and destroyed by Demetrius's fleet, while the third was caught in a violent storm and wrecked. Pleistarchus barely survived the sinking of his command ship and was eventually carried to Heraclea, where he spent the winter recovering. Meanwhile, the concentration of Antigonid forces in Asia gave Ptolemy the confidence to lead an army out of Egypt. He captured several cities in the southern Levant and laid siege to Sidon. However, he soon received false reports claiming that Antigonus had won a major victory and was marching south into Syria. Fearing an imminent counterattack, Ptolemy chose to garrison the cities he had taken and withdrew back into Egypt. Around the same time, Seleucus finally completed his march from the eastern satrapies, arriving in Cappadocia with his army, which he then ordered into winter quarters. As spring arrived, Antigonus and Demetrius began concentrating their forces near Synnada, while Lysimachus and Seleucus, eager for battle, did the same. Eventually, Their armies met roughly 50 miles northeast of Synnada, near the small village of Ipsus. Before the battle, Antigonus's forces numbered approximately 70,000 infantry, 10,000 cavalry, and 75 war elephants. The majority of his troops were likely drawn from his army in Syria, as Demetrius's forces in Greece had no elephants and only about 1,500 cavalry. Although Demetrius commanded a sizable force of 56,000 infantry in Greece, it remains uncertain how many of those troops accompanied him to Asia. Modern scholars estimate that of Antigonus's 70,000 infantry, around 40,000 were phalangites, while the remaining 30,000 consisted of various types of light infantry. The allied forces, consisting of Seleucus, Lysimachus, and their coalition, fielded approximately 64,000 infantry, 10,500 cavalry, 400 elephants, and 120 scythed chariots. Experts estimate that out of the Allies' infantry, between 30,000 and 40,000 were phalangites, with the remainder made up of lighter troops. Both armies deployed in the traditional Macedonian battle formation, positioning their phalanx at the center. Light infantry units were stationed at the front and flanks to serve as skirmishers, with elephants interspersed among them. The cavalry was divided between the two wings. On the Antigonid side, Demetrius commanded the elite cavalry on the right wing, while Antigonus remained at the center with his personal guard. Opposing them, Seleucus's son, Antiochus, led the cavalry on the left wing, traditionally the weaker flank meant for delaying actions. Seleucus deployed some of his elephants at the front of the battle line, though estimates suggest he kept around 300 in reserve. The battle commenced with a clash between the elephants of both armies, neither side gaining a clear advantage. Seizing the initiative, Demetrius launched a cavalry assault against the allied left wing under Antiochus. Despite Antiochus's best efforts, Demetrius's superior numbers and elite troops quickly routed the enemy cavalry. Hoping to secure a decisive victory, Demetrius pursued the fleeing allied horsemen. However, Seleucus saw his opportunity and swiftly deployed 300 reserve elephants to block Demetrius's return. When Demetrius finally realized his mistake and turned back, he found himself effectively cut off from the battlefield. The presence of such a large number of elephants made it impossible for his cavalry to break through, as the horses were unnerved by their scent and noise. Meanwhile, the Antigonid phalanx engaged the allied infantry in a fierce and chaotic struggle. With Demetrius isolated, the Antigonid right flank was left vulnerable. Recognizing this weakness, Seleucus ordered a detachment of cavalry and mounted archers from the allied right wing to exploit the opening. These horse archers rained down projectiles on the immobilized Antigonid phalanx. As their exposed flank crumbled, morale among Antigonus's troops collapsed, leading many to either defect to the allied side or flee. In the midst of the battlefield, Antigonus desperately tried to rally his troops, hoping for Demetrius's return. However, surrounded by enemy forces, he was ultimately killed. With their leader dead, the remnants of the Antigonid army disintegrated and the survivors scattered in full retreat. From the wreckage of his father's army, Demetrius managed to rally 5,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, leading them to Ephesus. From there, he immediately set sail for Greece, abandoning Asia to the victorious allies in a last-ditch effort to preserve what remained of his rule. Ptolemy, having prematurely withdrawn from Syria due to the false reports of an Antigonid victory, was left empty-handed in the post-battle territorial divisions. Instead, Lysimachus and Seleucus divided Antigonus's former Asian territories between themselves. Cassander's brother, Pleistarchus, was rewarded for his role in the campaign, with control over Cilicia and Lycia. Although Antigonus had been decisively defeated and killed, Demetrius still held sway over a significant portion of the Peloponnese. He remained determined to pursue his ambitions, with his sights now set on a conquest of Macedonia. Meanwhile, in Asia, a new conflict loomed. Ptolemy had long laid claim to Syria and the Levant, but following the Battle of Ipsus, these territories were officially granted to Seleucus, setting the stage for further strife. When the Battle of Ipsus ended in 301 BC, it marked the death not just of Antigonus Monophthalmus, but of any realistic dream of reuniting Alexander the Great's empire under a single ruler. The battlefield in central Phrygia saw a dramatic clash between the Antigonid faction and a coalition of three rival successors, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Cassander, with Ptolemy playing a distant but pivotal role. Although Antigonus had held firm in the center, with his veteran Macedonian phalanx, it was the timely arrival of Seleucus's Indian elephants and cavalry that turned the tide. His son, Demetrius, escaped, but the once mighty Antigonid realm had shattered. The victors of Ipsus carved up the remains. Lysimachus took most of Asia Minor, Seleucus seized Syria, and the eastern satrapies remained firmly under his control, and Cassander held Macedonia and Greece. Demetrius, though defeated, still held sway in some Greek cities and coastal fortresses, especially in the Peloponnese and Attica. Though wounded, he was far from finished. As the 290s BC unfolded, the question loomed: who among the successors would emerge as the true heir to Alexander? Cassander's health was failing, and in 297 BC, he died, plunging Macedonia into dynastic chaos. His sons, Philip IV, Antipater, and Alexander V, squabbled over succession. Philip IV briefly became king, but died within the same year, likely of illness. This left Antipater and Alexander in a tense power-sharing arrangement. Alexander V, fearing his brother, called in external help. He appealed to both Pyrrhus of Epirus and Demetrius. Pyrrhus, always eager for expansion, demanded and received large tracts of land in return for support. Demetrius, however, saw a greater opportunity. He arrived in force, assassinated Alexander, and seized control of Macedonia entirely by 294 BC, declaring himself king. Now back in the game, Demetrius Poliorcetes, the besieger, aimed to reclaim his father's lost empire. He launched ambitious campaigns across Greece and the Aegean, hoping to challenge Lysimachus in Asia Minor, and even dreaming of an eastern campaign against Seleucus. But despite his military brilliance, Demetrius's ambitions overreached his resources. A coalition quickly formed against him. Ptolemy launched naval raids, Lysimachus struck from the east, and Pyrrhus invaded from the west. By 288 BC, this coordinated assault forced Demetrius to abandon Macedonia. His own troops deserted, and he fled to Greece. Once again, Lysimachus and Pyrrhus divided Macedonia, but this uneasy alliance didn't last. In 285 BC, Lysimachus turned on Pyrrhus, driving him out and taking sole control of Macedonia, now adding it to his domains in Thrace and western Asia Minor. Lysimachus, by the mid-280s, stood as one of the most powerful monarchs. His empire stretched from the Aegean to the Hellespont and deep into Anatolia. He was a seasoned general, a veteran of Alexander's campaigns, and now king of Macedonia, the symbolic heart of the Macedonian legacy. But his kingdom was not as stable as it appeared. His court was rife with tension, and succession became a deadly question. Lysimachus's eldest son, Agathocles, was a competent and popular prince. Many in the court expected him to inherit the throne. But Lysimachus's new wife, Arsinoe II, daughter of Ptolemy I of Egypt, had other plans. She wanted the kingdom for her own children and began plotting Agathocles' downfall. Using accusations of treason and conspiracy with Seleucus, she convinced Lysimachus to execute his own son in 282 BC. The murder sent shockwaves. Many cities in Asia Minor that had been loyal to Agathocles now rebelled. Worse for Lysimachus, Agathocles' widow and children fled east, straight into the arms of Seleucus. Seleucus had already ruled over the largest and most stable of the successor kingdoms, encompassing Mesopotamia, Persia, Syria, and parts of India. Now in his 70s, he saw one final opportunity to reunite Alexander's empire, or at least remove his last serious rival. The death of Agathocles gave him the pretext he needed to act. In early 281 BC, Seleucus crossed into Asia Minor at the head of a large and battle-hardened army. Lysimachus marched to meet him near the town of Corupedium in Lydia. The Battle of Corupedium would be the final showdown between two of Alexander's original generals, the last great contest of the Diadochi. Though no detailed ancient sources give us exact numbers, most reconstructions suggest both sides brought forces in the range of 20,000 to 25,000 infantry, supported by 3,000 to 5,000 cavalry and light troops and skirmishers. The battle began with standard formations. Both sides formed long phalanx lines in the center, cavalry positioned on the wings. Seleucus, known for his cautious and methodical style, waited for a misstep. Lysimachus, more aggressive, tried to press the center, but was outmaneuvered on the left flank. Seleucus's cavalry, perhaps led by his son Antiochus, broke through the enemy horse and wheeled into the side of Lysimachus's phalanx. Pinned and outflanked, Lysimachus fought bravely, reportedly refusing to retreat. He was slain in the melee, bringing an end to his empire. His body was found on the battlefield, pierced with spears, a grim symbol of the final fall of the Diadochi. With Lysimachus dead, Seleucus moved quickly to seize his territory. By early 281 BC, he had crossed into Europe, preparing to claim Macedonia itself. At long last, he would rule both Asia and Macedonia, becoming the closest any of the successors had come to reuniting Alexander's empire. But fate had other plans. In September 281 BC, Seleucus was assassinated near Lysimachia in Thrace by Ptolemy Ceraunus, the exiled son of Ptolemy I of Egypt. Ceraunus had been sheltered by Seleucus but turned traitor, striking down the last of Alexander's generals. The dream of reunification died with Seleucus. Ceraunus seized the Macedonian throne in the chaos that followed. But his reign was brief and brutal. Within a year, the Gallic invasions of the Balkans began, a series of devastating raids by Celtic tribes from beyond the Danube. In 279 BC, at the Battle of Thermon, or possibly Lysimachia, Ptolemy Ceraunus was killed by the Gauls in battle, his head paraded on a spear. Macedonia fell into anarchy once again. The throne changed hands multiple times as the Gauls ravaged. Antipater Etesius, Sosthenes, and others briefly held power, but no one could establish lasting rule. Order was restored only in 277 BC, when Antigonus II Gonatas, the son of Demetrius the Besieger, returned with an army. He defeated the Gallic tribes at the Battle of Lysimachia, or possibly at the Spercheios, and secured the throne of Macedonia. With this, the Antigonid dynasty, once nearly extinct, was reborn. By 275 BC, the wars of the Diadochi had finally ended. The dust of half a century of conflict settled into three major Macedonian kingdoms: the Antigonids in Macedonia and Greece, the Seleucids in Asia, the Ptolemies in Egypt. The dream of Alexander's empire was dead, but his generals had built something new, a patchwork of kingdoms bound by culture, political ambition, and the memory of a man who had died too young. What began as a quest for unity ended in division, and in that division, a new age was born.